as those feelings unfold, as you kind of come through this process of self-discovery to determine the real you, and you express that, right? That is living the authentic life. You discover the real you, the real self. And what's the key here? What's authoritative? In this view of the human self, what's authoritative are the inner feelings and desires. There is no higher authority than the inner feelings and desires of the self.
Aaron, I would like for you to address the elephant in the room. Can you please tell our audience why you did not post a podcast last week?
Why I didn't. I love how this is all on me.
Why you're our producer. You're our executive
I'm definitely
producer.
not the
I've
producer.
just given you the title of executive producer. You now have the responsibility.
You could not put that on me. Yeah, so we didn't get to record a podcast last week, and I guess you want me to talk about why that is.
Yeah.
Besides that we have...
I want to be real and authentic with our audience. Let them know that we care.
That we're real people, that we're actual parents. Well, this is kind of a crazy time of year, I think, for everyone listening as well. End of the year, Christmas, Advent season. And we just, in particular, have had a lot of travel and work going on towards this end of the year. So that contributed to your lack of being able to record with me a podcast.
Yeah, well, honestly, it is the challenge of running an entire organization. The podcast is one of the many things that Maven does. And we are, our vision at Maven is to come alongside the local church, to come alongside families and grandparents and educators and youth pastors and everybody who has a stake in the next generation and discipling the next generation. And so the podcast is one of those resources. We also have video curriculums online. We have the Maven conference that we do. You and I speak. Our team is building the immersive experience program where we're leading students through a life-transforming trip. And these are all key components, and it's a lot to keep up with. Mm-hmm. And the Lord has provided a good team, but we are undermanned, and we continue to need the Lord to bring more people on, and we do need people who know Maven, who are being resourced by Maven. If we're helping you, if we're equipping you. We would love for you to partner with us and support this work. And December, it's kind of the end of the year. About 25% of our budget comes in. We are a 501c3, a nonprofit organization that relies on the partnership with the local church, with individuals in the local church, with Christians out there who believe in this work and support this work. So I would encourage you, if you are considering, donating, making an end of the year contribution, that you would consider supporting the work that we are doing, equipping the church, equipping parents, equipping church leadership to navigate this current cultural moment with a biblical worldview, with a Christian worldview. And so you can go to our website, maventruth.com, and in the upper right-hand corner, you can click on the donate button and partner with us in this work. And that will ensure, every donation will ensure that Aaron does not miss another podcast as our new executive producer.
That's a lot of pressure.
So, but for this week's podcast.
Yeah, well, speaking of partnering with local church, which is the heart of Maven, we did an event with a local church here in Southern California, and you did a talk that we thought would be good for a podcast. And maybe you want to talk about the talk that you did.
Oh yeah, well, I think if I am to quote you correctly, I think you said that talk changed my life, honey. or something like that.
I don't remember. That might have been a dream you had that
Oh.
I said that.
Could be. Well, no, there's a great church here in Southern California in Laguna Hills called Christ Community Church, Laguna Hills. And our good friend, Tim Thetford, who's also one of our Maven field guides who leads students on the immersive experiences, he's an associate pastor there. And he wanted to do an event shortly after the Supreme Court's decision on reversing Roe versus Wade. He wanted to do an event to talk about abortion. And so he brought in Scott Klusendorf, who is just an incredible voice for the unborn. And a good friend of ours, and we've done a ton of good work with Scott.
Yeah, and Scott actually will be at our Maven conference in February here in Southern California.
That's right. So, but Tim asked me to come and do this Friday night event where I would speak for about 30 minutes and then Scott would speak. And my job was really to lay out some of the cultural waters that we're living in. So I actually didn't talk a whole lot about abortion. I talked more about the culture, where we're at as a culture, what the mindset of the typical person in our culture is, and how that's shaping something like the abortion debate. But I would say probably, the first half hour of this is really just on the culture. There's a few minutes where I tie it into the abortion issue, but really I think this talk is helpful for all of us who are trying to raise the next generation to think about where the cultural mindset is. What is this world that our kids are growing up in? How is it shaping them? And particularly how it's causing them to really go inward and give authority to their feelings and their desires and their own personal thoughts. And it undermines so much of what, the Christian worldview. It undermines the whole idea of authority. It undermines that you are accountable to someone other than yourself. And so these are the cultural waters we live in. We need to understand them so that we can help our kids navigate them.
Yeah, so we hope you enjoy this talk that Brett gave, which is a good kind of overview of the culture and where we're at and how as parents and grandparents and youth leaders and Sunday school teachers, it's important that we understand these things as well.
Well, it is good to be here in Southern California because I live here. So I didn't have to get on a plane. But Southern California, this is my home, so this is my culture. Right? And I feel comfortable here with Southern Californians. I get a little uncomfortable when I'm on the East Coast with those uptight East Coast people. Wait, is this being live streamed to the East Coast? Apologies for all the East Coasters out there who are watching on the live stream. But living in a culture, there are certain things that just become normal for you, right? And so Southern California culture, it's laid back, it's beach culture, and so that just is kind of the norm for us, right? And in fact, that is how culture most powerfully shapes us, by simply presenting to us what is normal. And then we often, uncritically, absorb the culture around us without even thinking about it. And so here's what I want to do in my time tonight is I really want to set the table. And I want to step back a little bit for a while from the particular issue of abortion, and I want to look at kind of the cultural setting that we're in right now. What are the ideas that are being presented as the norm, and what are the ideas that are therefore shaping our hearts and our minds, okay? Now, many have described our culture that we live in as a post-truth culture. The Oxford English Dictionary defines post-truth this way: relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And I would say that's an accurate assessment of our cultural situation. We are in a post-truth culture where people can set aside objective facts in the name of their personal beliefs or personal desires or wants, right? And some would look and say, yeah, we can kind of look at the intellectual history of Western civilization, right? This is bequeathed to us from a postmodernism. A postmodernism that's really been a soil for all kinds of ideas in the culture. So ideas like deconstructionism, or social construction, or critical theory, or post-structuralism, pluralism, relativism. These are all ideas that grow out of this postmodern soil that ultimately leave the ivory towers of academia and trickle into popular culture. And so I don't want to get into the academic discussion on these things. I want to help you see how post-truth ideas have trickled into the culture. And so one of those ideas is this idea that things are socially constructed. Reality itself is socially constructed, right? A social construction is something that doesn't exist independently in the natural world. Instead, it's an invention or a construction of society. Right? And so maybe you've heard this conversation in the culture, particularly when it comes to issues of human sexuality. Right? There are those in the culture who will claim that these are social constructs. In fact, I want to show you a video. This is a video of an educator in Canada talking about a social construct. Let's show that video.
All right, there seems to be some confusion around what I mean when I say that virginity is a social construct. So first, let's talk about what a social construct is. A social construct is essentially an idea that as a culture we agree upon. Like it's just a general assumption about how things are. So yes, virginity is a social construct. And then there's this other argument like, but that doesn't mean it's not real. No, the social construct is real. The word is real. And so we have all agreed socially that virginity is a state of being before having sex. We all agree on that. That's why it's a social construct. And there are lots of things that are social constructs, like time, or government, or organized religion, gender, masculinity or femininity. And the thing about a social construct is that it is made up. It's not representing something that is real. And we all choose as a culture to participate in it or not. And what I'm saying is virginity is something that we can challenge. We don't have to accept this social construct, especially because it's rooted in patriarchy and purity culture and the oppression of women. So we can actually let that social construct go. If it feels right to use that for yourself, then use it for yourself. But recognize that it's actually not a real thing. It's made up.
Okay. Now, we could probably spend the rest of my time just dissecting what she said there, okay? But I want you to pay attention to a couple of things. Number one, the language that she's using. That something like virginity is merely a social construct. And she says it doesn't mean it's not real, but what did she say is real? What's real are the words we use. So it's the language that we use that constructs reality, but it doesn't refer to actually something that's real in the natural world. And so if we want to use this because it's useful and helpful, go ahead. If you want to use it for you, that's fine. But if you don't want to, you can cast it off because it's merely a social construct, right? And so this is the language of our culture. And you have to pay attention to the language of our culture. It will help you understand the mindset of our culture. So for instance, you have a lot of people in the culture who talk about your truth. Live your truth, right? Oprah Winfrey in 2018, when she was accepting a Golden Globes award for a Lifetime Achievement Award, in her comments regarding women, she used this line. She said, "What I know for sure is that speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have." Right? And so there is one of the mantras of our culture. live your truth, speak your truth. Right? And what is communicated by that? What's communicated is that there's this relativistic view of truth. You have yours, I have mine. It's relative to each of the individuals in our society. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because we have raised generations with these kinds of messages. So if you've ever been exposed to the magical kingdom, right, of Disney, here's just an example. Mulan, right? The animated feature Mulan had this really popular song entitled True to Your Heart. And this just represents pretty much every message of every Disney movie that's out there. And in the song True to Your Heart, the lyrics go like this, right? True to your heart, you must be true to your heart. Open your eyes, your heart can tell you no lies. Your heart knows what's good for you. Let your heart show you the way, it'll see you through, right? And that is just the message that's repeated and repeated and repeated in the culture. Or here, I'm going to show you a Diet Coke commercial. This Diet Coke commercial captures the relativism that is so pervasive in our culture. Watch this.
Look, here's the thing about Diet Coke. It's delicious. It makes me feel good. Life is short. If you want to live in a yurt, yurt it up. If you want to run a marathon, I mean, that sounds super hard, but okay. I mean, just do you, whatever that is. And if you're in the mood for a Diet Coke, have a Diet Coke. Diet Coke, because I can.
Okay, so you're like, Brett, come on, relax. It's a Diet Coke commercial, right? Well, no, what sometimes these artifacts of culture, what they do is they reflect the ideas that permeate the culture. And there's three things in that short 30-second commercial that I want you to pay attention to. Number one, what's the basis for drinking Diet Coke? It makes me feel good, right? And isn't that the idea of in our culture, do what makes you feel good? Whether it's drink Diet Coke or whether it's sleep with whoever you want or whether it's choose your career, whatever it is, the basis is what makes you personally feel good. What's true for you? Live your truth, right? And so she uses that phrase kind of midway through, you do you. Right? You do you, I'll do me. It's relative to the individual. And then there's this last phrase in that commercial. Right at the end, it says, because I can. Because I can. And this is actually, I think, a little bit of a deeper move, a deeper step. It's not just, what I think or what I determine is true. The only thing that I consider is, well, what can I do? What am I able to do? And then that's what's true for me. Now, so while I think we are a post-truth culture, I think this kind of the relativism in the culture is something that's pretty obvious. We see it all around. But I want us to understand that it goes deeper than this. It's not merely kind of our views on truth. In fact, I would encourage everyone in here and everyone who's watching to get a book. It's a book by Carl Trueman called Strange New World, and this is kind of an abridged version of his larger book, which is entitled The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But Strange New World will give you a really good sense of why we are at this place in our culture and how these certain ideas have come to dominate our culture and what those ideas are. And it's not just that our culture is relativistic in its views of truth. It goes deeper than that. And Trueman, in his book, talks about the idea of the self. The self. The modern self refers to the real me, right? And what's happened in our culture is that we have elevated the modern self, or the real me, to the highest pinnacle of our human identity. And so happiness and meaning, those kinds of things are found in the realization and fulfillment of the real you or the real me. So this is not just a question of our views about truth. This has to do with our very identity. And here's what Truman says. This is a good summary of what he says in his book. He says, the modern self assumes the authority of inner feelings and sees authenticity as defined by the ability to give social expression to the same. The modern self also assumes that society at large will recognize and affirm this behavior. Such a self is defined by what is called expressive individualism. Expressive individualism. That phrase right there captures the modern mindset. It's the idea that each person has a unique core of feeling, and that as those feelings unfold, as you kind of come through this process of self-discovery to determine the real you, and you express that, right? That is living the authentic life. You discover the real you, the real self. And what's the key here? What's authoritative? In this view of the human self, what's authoritative are the inner feelings and desires. There is no higher authority than the inner feelings and desires of the self. And so we see this reflected in pop culture. So let's go back to Disney, for instance. In Moana, right? Moana, the popular animated feature. Moana is she's got this internal struggle about whether or not she should obey kind of the laws of her land, obey her father. And then the wise old grandma comes to her with some advice. And here's the advice that she sings to Moana. She says, "You are your father's daughter. Stubbornness and pride. Mind what he says, but remember, you may hear a voice inside. And if the voice starts to whisper to follow the farthest star, Moana, that voice inside is who you are." Notice the shift in language. It's not just follow your heart. Your heart will tell you, the path to go. It's that the voice inside is who you are. And so what is the authority? The authority are those inner feelings. This is the expressive individualism that Truman talks about in Strange New World. And we see this played out in the culture, right? Very clearly we see this being played out in the gendered conversation, don't we? So who is this individual? This is Ellen Page, right? Ellen Page is a famous actress. It was in a number of different popular movies. Inception was one of those. Well, Ellen Page recently, last year, went through a very public transition to become Elliot Page, right? And Elliot was then featured on the cover of Time magazine to tell her story about transitioning. And I want you to notice the language that's being used, right? Look at the cover of Time magazine. I'm fully who I am. Okay, well, what does that mean? I'm fully who I am. Well, in the interview, Elliot says this: I can't begin to express how remarkable it feels to finally love who I am enough to pursue my what? My authentic self. Right? There you go. The modern self, the authentic self, the real me is determined by how I feel inside, such that we are at a place in our culture where if you are a biological male, but you have feelings of discomfort, or you have feelings that you are a female, and you can do that thing, then that's the authentic self, and you pursue that, right? And then what is everyone else around us supposed to do? We're supposed to affirm you in that, because that is your true and authentic self. This is the cultural situation we're at. In fact, we even see this idea played out at the highest levels of our country, right? And so, writing for the majority opinion in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey ruling, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy says this, right? He said, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. At the heart of liberty. Notice that phrase, at the heart of liberty. And so, you and I, as free beings in a free society, well, what's at the heart of that? It's to define our own concept of existence. There's no authority outside of us. It's all right in here. And so this is a radical shift in our view of human nature. Right? If you look at Western civilization, this is a radical shift. Where now identity, the real self, has become an idol in our culture. And it's determined simply by my inner feelings and thoughts. Now, of course, this impacts other views that we hold. And so our changing views of human nature, what it means to be human, have led to a radical shift in our view of freedom. Right? And Kennedy expresses it here, at the heart of liberty. Liberty is synonymous with freedom. And what he's expressing is a particular definition of freedom. But when we look at what freedom has traditionally meant, what it's meant in our country, when we look at the way that the founders talked about liberty, what we find is a radical revision of that original definition. Now, what Kennedy is referring to is what we might call freedom from. Freedom from. Right? So now the general definition of our culture for freedom is that it's freedom from something. That's what it means to be truly free. It means that you're free from something. On this view, freedom is absolute autonomy. And so it means that you and I are free from external influence or external control. There are no rules. There are no restraints, no responsibilities, just the individual doing whatever they want, whenever they want. That is now at the core of Americans' view of freedom, right? And so freedom now is the individual deciding everything for themselves. And when freedom from all restraints becomes the primary goal of life, our options and our choices become idols to us, don't they? Now, we contrast with the classical view. The classical view of freedom is not freedom from, it's freedom for. Freedom for. And in this kind of freedom, it's the power to do what we ought to do. It's not the freedom from all restraints to do whatever it is we want. It's not just what we want to do, but it's what we ought to do. And so what is assumed by the question, even think about it, what is assumed by this view? What's assumed is that there is an ought. There's some kind of external way, some external ought that we ought to live by, right? So for example, we ought to tell the truth, or we ought to let innocent people live. We ought to love our neighbor. We ought to fulfill our duties to family. This definition of freedom assumes the existence of objective moral values and obligations. So notice this kind of freedom requires something else. It requires not just the self, but it requires truth, specifically moral truth. But a truth that is objective and that stands outside of us. And so we don't create that truth. No, we want to live in accordance with that truth. And think about this idea of freedom for. This definition requires rules and restraints. So obviously, if I ought to let innocent people live, then I must restrain myself from harming them, right? I must live by rules that prohibit me from taking their life. So there's restraints in this kind of freedom. But we would look at that and say, well, obviously those restraints are good, aren't they? Those restraints are good, even though they put limits on what I can do. So this freedom really is the power to do what we ought to do. But what we ought to do communicates that there is a purpose larger than any one of us that we ought to live for. Right? We ought to live for the protection of others. We ought to use our freedom for the benefit of our own character and moral development. We should have freedom for the flourishing as a human being or for fulfilling our human nature. So freedom for says, no, it's not that we don't have any restraints, but that we are to live in a certain particular way. And when we live in the way that we were designed to live, that actually brings about true freedom. Think about an athlete, right? Does an athlete say, my goal is to get to a point where I have absolute freedom on, let's say, the basketball court? So who's maybe the greatest NBA player of all time? Maybe Michael Jordan, okay? And I know that's up for debate. But if you think it's LeBron, let me just say you're wrong, okay? That's objectively true. Michael Jordan. He didn't go on the court and say, okay, my goal is to cast off all restraints. In fact, think about what he would do in practice. In practice, he would actually hone his skills by restraining himself, by learning how to live within the rules. And within that restraint, he achieved a kind of freedom that allowed him to be the greatest basketball player ever. He had a freedom for basketball. It wasn't a freedom from restraints. But this is what has happened in our culture as we have now taken the modern self and elevated it and said now the inner feelings are authoritative and that determines the real you, the real me. This has shifted our view of freedom. And now what I want to help you see is how this then also impacts our cultural conversation on the issue of abortion, okay? So think about this phrase here. Maybe you're familiar with this phrase. Safe, legal, and rare, right? Do you remember this phrase? Yeah, this phrase is in the past, isn't it? This was a kind of one of the primary cultural mantras of abortion advocates. Hey, we want to keep abortion safe, legal, and rare. But the shift in identity, you see reflected in the shift and now the abortion advocates' reframing of this issue. So now what is maybe the primary slogan that you hear from abortion advocates? My body, my choice, right? Is that not a significant shift from safe, legal, rare to now my body, my choice? In fact, in 2019, the New York Times had an article discussing how the Democratic presidential candidates were reframing the abortion debate. And the article was entitled, On Abortion Rights, 2020 Democrats Move Past Safe, Legal, and Rare. And here's what the article said. It said the Democratic presidential field has coalesced around an abortion rights agenda more far-reaching than anything past nominees have proposed, according to a New York Times survey of the campaigns. The positions reflect a hugely consequential shift on one of the country's most politically divisive issues. Okay, what's that shift? Well, the article goes on to summarize it here. It says, now almost every candidate says the next president should actively reframe the debate. Their language focuses on health care, bodily autonomy, and at times, even the idea of abortion as a positive force enabling women to control their lives and increase their economic security. Do you see the shift? Bodily autonomy. Abortion as a positive force doing what? Enabling women to control their lives. Because in a culture where the self has been elevated and the self is authoritative to achieve one's authentic person, well then any restraint is going to be viewed as oppressive, right? And notice the language of the culture, right? We hear that term oppression thrown around all the time. Here is a couple of tweets from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? In the House of Representatives. Now notice the language that's being used by the abortion advocate. Abortion bans aren't just about controlling women's bodies. So they are about that, but not just about that. They're about controlling women's sexuality, owning women. From limiting birth control to banning comprehensive sex ed, U.S. religious fundamentalists are working hard to outlaw sex that falls outside their theology. Because with the modern self, right, sex and what is right is by definition determined by your desires. If you want to do it, the internal voice is the authoritative voice, and then you should be able to do it, right? And she goes on to say this, ultimately this is about women's power. When women are in control of their sexuality, it threatens a core element underpinning right-wing ideology, patriarchy. It's a brutal form of oppression to seize control of the one essential thing a person should command, their own body. And what I'm just trying to get you to do is to pay attention to the language that's being used and the shift in the reframing of this conversation. Now, what is primary? What is primary is the individual self and their own desires and their feelings. That's the cultural context in which we're living. And it's a challenge, isn't it? And so, those of us who are pro-life advocates, right? We, for many, many years, those in the pro-life community have been unified around at least one thing, and that is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And this year, we were privileged to see the Supreme Court overturn that decision. But as the question of this event stands, okay, what's next? What do we do? Was that simply the end goal? Well, of course not. And what we need to think about are what we do next. But I want you to understand that we may have been unified kind of in that idea of like, kind of the same idea that we need to overturn Roe v. Wade. But now there's a lot of work to do. There's maybe more work to do, where we were kind of singularly focused on that in some ways, although we were doing a lot more than just that. But we were unified in that vision. Now what do we do that Roe v. Wade is overturned? And what we need to think about is not just a next step, but really we need to think in terms of next steps. Next steps. In fact, in a few minutes, Scott's going to come up and he's going to lay out for us some of the important next steps that we need to take. I want to say one thing in particular in terms of next step. One of the next steps that we need to take or continue to take in the church and in our families and in our ministries is we must redouble our efforts in worldview training. We must redouble our efforts in worldview training. What is a worldview? A worldview is simply your picture of reality. It's your picture of reality. Francis Schaeffer, who was a theologian, apologist, a pastor, a prophetic voice in the 70s and the 80s, wrote a book called A Christian Manifesto. And he was assessing kind of evangelical Christianity in America. And here's what he says in that book. He said, the basic problem of the Christians in this country in the last 80 years or so, in regard to society and in regard to government, is that they have seen things in bits and pieces instead of totals. They have very gradually become disturbed over permissiveness, pornography, the public schools, the breakdown of the family, and finally, abortion. But they have not seen this as a totality, each thing being a part, a symptom of a much larger problem. They have failed to see that all of this has come about due to a shift in worldview. That is through a fundamental change in the overall way people think and view the world and life as a whole. And so Schaeffer said this back he wrote this back in 1981. And I don't think we've corrected the problem. The primary problem, he says, is a shift in worldview. Let me help illustrate this. Think about the basic American mind, okay? The typical modern American citizen. And if we were to take all their thoughts and dump them out on a table, and each of their thoughts was represented by an individual puzzle piece, it would look something like this, right? We dump it out, and there would be just kind of a disconnected pile of ideas and beliefs. And guess what? It's not a whole lot different for a lot of Christians who have not thought carefully about their Christianity. We have all of these ideas and these beliefs, but we're not sure how they really fit together. And so what worldview training does is it takes those pieces and helps form them into a coherent whole. That begins to take each individual piece, and together it forms a larger picture. And it makes sense of that individual piece in terms of the larger picture. Now, what are a couple of ways to derail your puzzle? If you're trying to put together a puzzle, how can you derail that? Well, number one, if you have missing pieces, right? If you've got missing pieces in your puzzle, you won't be able to see the full picture. And if you've got enough of them, you'll be missing a significant portion of that picture. What's another thing that can derail your puzzle is when you have the wrong piece. If you've got the wrong piece in a puzzle and you're trying to fit this piece in the puzzle and you can't get it to fit. And I think this is a great description of a lot of us where we don't have a complete picture of the Christian worldview. And so we've got key pieces that are missing. Or we're trying to take pieces that don't fit in our worldview and try to fit them into our worldview. This is why I think helps explain why someone can claim to be a Christian and yet hold views that abortion should be permissible through the entire pregnancy. I would argue that that's a piece that doesn't fit in the Christian worldview. Now think about where you start with the Christian, or think about where you start with a puzzle. Where do you start when you start to put together a puzzle? You start with the edges, don't you? Why do you start with the edges and corners? Because when you put together the edges and the corners, it will create a frame. And then in that frame, it will be easier then to figure out where the other pieces fit. Imagine starting, if you could identify the very middle piece of the puzzle, putting that down on the table, and then trying to put together the puzzle starting with a middle piece. Would that be very difficult? Yes, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of success. Instead, you need that framework. Now, in the same way, when it comes to our views and our beliefs and our ideas, we have all of these different views on gender or sexuality or family or money or politics or technology or education or abortion. These are all individual puzzle pieces that must be placed in a larger framework if we truly want to make sense of these issues. And I think this is absolutely essential for the next generation. Often they come to us with questions about issues like gender ideology. And we deal with that question in isolation, and our answers don't make sense to them. Because many of them don't have a larger Christian worldview in place that answers the biggest questions of life. Like, where did we come from? What does it mean to be human? What's the purpose of all this? How should I live? Is there life after death? These are the big, important worldview questions. And when we answer those questions from a Christian worldview, it then creates a frame that makes sense of the different puzzle pieces. And this is why, in respect to abortion, worldview training is absolutely essential. So that we create a framework that makes sense of our views on abortion. And when we do that, we create what's called a plausibility structure. It's like a web in the mind. You think about a web, certain insects will fly into a web and they'll stick. Well, if the web in our mind is a Christian worldview, there will be certain ideas, like our views on abortion, our views on gender, that will stick in that mind. But a secular mind, those ideas won't stick. And so this is why Christian worldview thinking is so important. Let me give you a couple of resources and I'll wrap this up. This is why Maven exists. Aaron and I started Maven 5 years ago to help pass on the Christian worldview and Christian truth to the next generation. So I would encourage you, go to our website, maventruth.com, check out our resources. Next February, we will be holding our 5th annual Maven Conference, February 24th and 25th. It's just going to be up the street at Crossline Community Church here in Southern California, and one of our speakers is going to be Scott Klusendorf, where we will take Christian truth and apply it to every area of life. Now, why do we do an event like this? Why do we discuss a difficult topic like abortion? Right? Why do we wade into this mess? I mean, wouldn't it be easier if we just were kind of quiet and just, went along to get along? I mean, that I would love to do that. It would just be a lot easier, right? It would keep my life a little more conflict-free. I would get less, mean emails after an event like this. Why do we do something like this? We do it because we love the culture and we love the people in the culture. That's why we do this. That's why we speak on this. But love does not mean affirmation. That's the culture's definition. Love is not merely affirmation. Here is how C.S. Lewis defines it. He says, love is not just affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. That's what it means to truly love someone. It's to pursue their good as far as we can because we love them. And we ultimately want them to flourish. If we love the culture around us, we want the culture to flourish, to experience life as it was designed to be experienced. And that design is laid out for us clearly in Genesis 1. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So he created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. According to God's design, we flourish when we live as image bearers should live. And this issue of abortion strikes at the heart of that. For those men and women who have experienced abortion, right? We speak the truth of them out of love because we want them to flourish. How do we navigate this culture? Well, Pascal was a French mathematician, physicist, a theologian. And I think he summarizes our approach to this. And Scott is going to come up here and he's going to give us a lot more practical detail. But all of it is done out of love. And this is what Pascal says. He says, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. This is why we must do worldview training. This is why we must get trained in pro-life apologetics. But then there's a second step. He says this, next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true. And then show that it is worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature, attractive because it promises true good. That's what we want to do. We want to lay out that vision that when we live according to the truth of reality, which is the truth of God and God's word, that is the only way to achieve true good. And when we do that, we can have an impact in the culture around us.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.